I would like to invite and welcome our distinguished guests to this important event. I would also like to use this opportunity to extend my profound gratitude to my colleagues at IFK, particularly Tandy, Numbele, and Jabulani. I also like to appreciate the UJ Library, because without them, this event wouldn't have been happening. So I would also like to express my gratitude to our distinguished panelists. And if you permit me to be a bit lighter in this regard, if we were to form our own government of national unity within this room, how would that look like? I hope you will not find me too ambitious if I assign the role of the president to myself. Professor Vicky Graham, I know you're my boss, but would you mind being...
Yeah, be careful here.
Yeah. I know that I might be punished after this event, but I'm stubborn. Would you mind being the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation?
I think I could squeeze it in.
Okay, I think she has accepted the position, but you will have to compete with the formidable Mr. Laya Zaya from DECO. Professor Rugunana, would you consider the Department of Agriculture or Land Reform and Rural Development?
It's not my area, but yeah.
But you would have to compete with Professor Ngomezulu. Professor Nganje, I've strategically placed you in the Department of Home Affairs. And the Code SARS would have to compete for the Department of Higher Education. Colleagues, on a serious note, I'm glad to witness an important event like this, and I look forward to this exciting and thought-provoking event. Without further ado, I would like to invite the chair of the first panel, Professor Pragna Rugunana, who is the Vice Dean at the Faculty of Humanities here at UJ. Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you for the very warm welcome, Dr. Teller. I do appreciate the importance of this particular event and seminar, and as well as the important theme that you are discussing today, which is the GNU and the future of South Africa's domestic and foreign policy. Because I think given the circumstances around the world currently, this is such an important, not only portfolio, but discussion to be had this particular afternoon, and very so soon after the development of the GNU in South Africa. Before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge the Somali Ambassador. Thank you very much for being here today. We do appreciate your presence, and welcome to you at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you. And it gives me great pleasure to chair the first panel, which is of the GNU and domestic politics. And very importantly, it gives me great pleasure to call upon my colleague. So there's been a slight change in the program, and Professor Victoria Graham, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Administration at the University of Johannesburg, will be giving her first will be delivering the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I wanted to thank Dr. Teller again and everyone here for allowing me to make the change in this program, because unfortunately I have to leave directly after my presentation. Thank you again for the invite. And Tandy, thank you for the accommodation of my request in moving the program. Okay. All right, so I wanted to begin by saying that my background is actually in quality of democracy studies. I wanted to approach this topic, and it is quite a complex topic, from that specific perspective. All right, so what's the big idea? But actually, it's quite a specific discipline. So this is why I feel like I need, because while I assume that most, if not all people here have an understanding of what democracy is to some degree, by the way, it's very difficult to do because there are hundreds of definitions of democracy that exist, right? I wanted to spend a moment or two explaining the importance of quality of democracy studies, because I think it makes a real difference in our understanding of how good our democracy is. Okay, so just indulge me as I take a few moments to prepare us with that context. Now, any research that's undertaken on quality of democracy really assesses how well the democratic systems function, right, in practice, focusing not just on the presence, obviously, of democratic institutions, but on the extent to which these institutions operate effectively and efficiently, and really importantly, in our case, inclusively, right? So we're looking really at the degree to which the country is democratic. And of course, there are a number of variables that overlap here, and it's a very interwoven discipline. And so this makes it even more complex when you try and analyze a topic in this space. But some of the indicators of quality of democracy then that would specifically apply in this discussion around the GNU and its impact domestically would be elements like, or indicators like, the democratic role of political parties in a competitive multi-party democracy, institutional and administrative capacity, which is an important one. An obvious one, the presence of corruption. We hope the lack thereof, obviously. Vertical accountability, which basically boils down in essence to public trust, okay, which we don't seem to have much of in this country at the moment. And effective and responsive government, which is another really important one. Now, I have to confess, when I first saw this topic, my quality of democracy trained brain wanted to argue immediately that any real analysis of the actual felt impact of the GNU on domestic politics actually requires a long time and systematic assessment against specific criteria. And that's where I went immediately in my head. And I say that because I think we as a people generally are accustomed to making snap judgments about things that aren't really fully informed, right? I think that's fair to say. I mean, if we really analyze ourselves, I think it's fair to say that. And it's difficult because news of the day stories that we read are not academically rigorous necessarily, and they're sometimes, and maybe even often, not really fair to the topic at hand. I always remember reading this quote from one of the key researchers in democratic studies, one of them, Calland, who said, "Emotion, personal prejudice, and news of the day are poor indicators of democracy, and they lead to false pessimism or false optimism." So I think it's important that we understand that we can't just take news of the day or headlines from newspapers as a guarantee of our understanding of how well we're doing as a democracy. I don't think that's fair to do, right? So I think it's important that we know or acknowledge that even after 100 days of GNU, it might be too soon still, actually, to provide any kind of definitive answer, read the impact of the GNU, because as I mentioned before, there are so many interwoven variables and really knock-on effects of decisions that are taken or in fact not taken, and these would all need to be considered. So bearing all this in mind then, we also understand that if we are going to audit this type of democracy or this element of democracy, that is the impact of the GNU, we are essentially engaging in this systematic assessment of institutional performance against what I said before, these specified criteria, which we then have to decide upon, of course, right? So we have to do this because it provides us with an authoritative judgment, a reasonably authoritative judgment, I should qualify, as to how satisfactory our processes are and the arrangements of our institution. And if we are supposed to function effectively then, specifically in regard to the GNU, then that means that our institutions, which there are many, but here Parliament and government are obviously the most important, and they are responsible for administrating what goes on in our country. So high quality legislation production is important, and that means effective policy making and effective implementation of policy, which might not be easy to do in a coalition where people can't agree. Transparent policy making processes obviously are important, and the presence of a professional, neutral, accountable, and efficient state bureaucracy. All of these have to be in place for there to be effective policy making. And so these would need to be assessed if we're going to look at impact, right? It's also important to acknowledge that the quality of democracy in a country is underpinned by the ability of those in power to engage lawfully in their duties. This, I think, is a no-brainer, and I think we all understand that this has to be the case. So integrity in government has to be key. And it's vital to analyse any instances of abuse of power by the state that occur in any instances, as well as any existence or implementation of legislative frameworks that might prevent or fight corruption. So any move by any government to prevent that from happening would obviously be a problem for our democracy. We also need to consider the fact that the government needs to be responsive to people's needs and also to people's perceptions, unfortunately, because those are not necessarily the same thing. And people perceive what they want to perceive, and that's obviously often dependent on how they define a problem, which could be different to the person next door and the person next door. So that makes it even more complicated for government to deliver on effective policy making. But when we refer to government responsiveness, we're really talking about the capacity of government to satisfy the governed or us by executing policies in a way that correspond to what we want, so our demands. And it relates then to the degree to which the public trust the leaders. So we have to have trust in our leaders, and the leaders have to have trust that they have our trust. Hopefully you followed that line of argument. In order for them to indicate how responsive they can be, and we need to believe that our officials are actually there on our behalf, so that our interests are being represented. And all of this is tied up in an indicator called government's responsiveness. Most often in our case to service delivery demands, because that's often what we find to be true in South Africa. But obviously there are many other kinds of demands, and we see these come up all the time. But so then we would therefore need this 2024 GNU then to demonstrate good institutional and administrative capacity. I say no corruption, although I think that that's a bit too ambitious, but it should be the case. Political parties working together, even in acknowledgement of and despite their differences, which we know that they have, right? It's not news to us, but all of this for the betterment of society, obviously. And all of this also in an effective and responsive way while continuing to build public trust. So really they have their work cut out for them, actually, because there's a lot they have to do. And so given this topic then of analysing the impact then of the GNU on domestic politics, and understanding that I can't really do a rigorous assessment of this topic in relation to this at this time, then I'm going to just suggest a few areas then of potential positive and negative impact, because it's not really possible to do, what I would like to do, maybe in a couple of years' time. So the formation of the GNU in South Africa, as we know, obviously marks a significant shift in our landscape in politics. There are implications for all of the indicators I mentioned with regard to quality of democracy, particularly in relation to governance, but also obviously economic policy, and the one that I mentioned before and heavily emphasized, public trust, because that'll come up again and again and again. And one of the biggest tests for this new government really is tackling unemployment and poverty. I don't think any of these is really news to you sitting here in the audience. I think we all know this is the case, but it's important, I think, to say it every now and then that this is what we need to refocus on. But also it's about building social cohesion in society. And that is a tall ask, because I'm not even sure that there was really any social cohesion really fundamentally since we became a democracy, actually. I don't know if necessarily all the big debates really took place that should have taken place around race, etc., back when they should have happened, to the degree that they should have. And so I question that idea around social cohesion in society, and also how is government supposed to build social cohesion when there's a lack of cohesion within the GNU itself? That's a problem, obviously. And then again, I come back to the key one, which is public trust, again, because this is obviously important, but it also connects to the notion of a sense of mental and emotional well-being amongst the population, because generally the argument is that if you're happier, then you're less inclined to argue because you don't really have anything to argue about, right? So that's the argument anyway around this. So I think it's widely understood that public sentiment leading up to the elections this year indicated obviously widespread dissatisfaction with government, and whether that was really a true reflection of what government has done or not done is a different matter altogether, because perception will always be perception. So it's what you choose to believe, right? And you will act on that belief, whether it's true or not, really. So, but the point is that there's obvious dissatisfaction with government performance, particularly in regard to these areas of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, which are key problems still with us in South Africa. So then, what are the potential positive and negative impacts that we would need to look at with regard to the GNU? Now, I think we all understand, or at least know here, that the coalition controls about 70% of the National Assembly, right? Which allows it then to implement policies more effectively than obviously a minority government would. Now, this is great news for South Africa, if everything goes well, of course, which never happens. So we have to park that good news for now. So the GNU then aims to foster cooperation amongst its members, and I really do believe that there is an intent to do that. But the differing agendas that we know exist will always be a challenge. And this challenge then that is posed is a problem for unified governance. And I emphasize the word unified there, because it all comes back to unity and whether or not you decide to work together. So, and we know that it's no secret, of course, that there are ideological differences amongst all of our parties here. key one being economic philosophies. That's the obvious one, right? But there are others too. And conflicting political priorities between these partners. So another thing that I wanted to mention was that there's obviously also the problem of internal factional politics as well. So not only do you have to contend with working together across different ideologies and between and amongst parties, but you also have to get your own people on side too, which is even more of a problem in actually delivering on effective policymaking. So all of these things add up to making it a very difficult situation for government to be in. We've already seen this happen, right? We've seen this emerge over a number of discussions already. There's problems, of course, with different perspectives on the National Health Insurance Act and labour policies, which we're even, feeling here at UJ at the moment. Crime and corruption, which are still very present and just increasing all the time. And problems around making sure that people invest in us more. So increasing public investment confidence is a big one. And all of these are serious concerns. And our parties don't really agree on any of these things fundamentally. So there's this need to overcome that, obviously. But another thing that's important for us is with regard to stability, because the establishment of the GNU in the first place was really seen as a way to address the fact that we didn't really have majority win. So it's a great way to ensure stability, of course. I mean, we can carry on without a problem in government, and it's a necessary step. All right, we had to stabilize South Africa's governance because we had to make sure we, didn't go even further down in economic estimations, etc. And we didn't want to be seen as an uncertain government into the world, the global environment. So this is true, and political analysts have argued and probably will continue to argue that while the GNU may not directly lead to economic growth, like in and of itself, it obviously creates an environment that's conducive to investor confidence. And so you need to make sure that that stability remains. And you need to make sure that this leads to stimulated growth and obviously job creation, right? So then, in conclusion of my points then, I wanted to say that getting on the same page is obviously a necessary requirement for effective policy making going forward. And there's intense public pressure around this because everyone's looking to the GNU to either fail outright, because people are like that, it's humanity, or to demonstrate effective governance and actually showcase that they can work together and that they can deliver on promises of reform and growth. And obviously, failure to meet these expectations could lead to even further disillusionment among voters. And that's what I'm mostly concerned about, because as a quality of democracy and researcher, analyst, I'm very concerned about anything that would lead to people not turning out at the polls to vote and using that formal space to showcase what they're feeling and their public voice. And so this is very important, I think, in analysing where we're going to go from here, and obviously has an impact too on the quality of democracy of the country. So I wanted to conclude really just by saying that the government does have its work cut out for itself, but I think that there is genuine desire to overcome issues in order to better society and have a societal impact that it actually improves society. And I'd like to think that that positive response to societal problems will actually allow them to overcome all these many other myriad challenges that they face as a government or coalition. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Prof. I'm sorry again that I have to now leave after this presentation.
Thank you so much, Prof. Vicky Graham, for that really inspiring and very interesting, I must say. I think you also set the foundation quite nicely for this particular theme. And we do appreciate that you have really a demanding schedule and going to sort out some sort of crisis. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. So it gives me great pleasure then to call upon Professor Jolene Steyn-Kotze, who is the Chief Research Specialist at the Human Science Research Council, to give her presentation. I don't have the title of her presentation, but I'm sure she will share it with us.
Thank you so much and good afternoon. I don't have a formal title of a presentation because I was thinking really around this question of domestic politics, of foreign policy, and in my engagements with Dr. Teller, my first response to him was, but I know nothing about foreign policy. And it dawned on me a little bit later on that actually we do. Through the Human Sciences Research Council's South African Social Attitude Survey, we've actually run 1 or 2 survey modules around questions of foreign policy, as well as foreign policy priorities. So For me, then, I think what became a little bit of an anxiety-inducing exercise was then trying to say, okay, but I know what the knowledge, attitudes, priorities, and goals are of the South African public with regards to foreign policy. But what does that tell me around linking it to a context of a GNU? And I'm very, very grateful to Professor Graham for her presentation, especially when she had noted questions of public trust and indicators of quality of democracy, because I think when we start looking at public trust, at indicators of quality of democracy, at quality of governance, at how well the country is working, it does tend to somehow shape world views. So we may have a more negative perception of the world because we feel politically things are not going well, economically things are not going well, or we may have a more optimistic view of the world, thinking that, you know, politically things are going well and economically things are going well. And it really links into some of the work we had done on well-being as well, where we had found that South Africans are becoming increasingly pessimistic about their medium-term life satisfaction over a period of 5 years. And that for us was quite a significant finding, because it was the first time that we had picked up this almost sense of pessimism that my life will not get better within the next 5 years. And with this brief context then, the question that I need to look at is, domestically, what is the GNU and how is it going to impact possibly on our foreign policy? But before I share some of my observations and some of my reflections that I had noted down, I just briefly wanted to share as well that when we look at the ebb and flow around foreign policy values, and we look at the soft power that South Africa wants to present to the globe in terms of its foreign policy priorities, we do note very much negotiation, collaboration, let's get together and talk, really building on what we had in 1994, which was a government of national unity, which was successfully navigating a transition without any, I would say, widespread violence, if one can put it that way. And almost what many have come to term the Mandela effect, so to speak. So we negotiated and we presented this image to the world. And as we move on and we start looking at the various eras of foreign policy, so we noted under the Mandela administration, for example, we had a foreign policy cemented in a position based on advancing human rights, peace, and friendship. And we saw that through, for example, the numerous interventions South Africa had in terms of conflict resolution and getting involved in trying to facilitate peace-building exercises or peace-building negotiations and talks. We know that through the Mbeki administration, for example, we noted quite a strong push towards an African Renaissance, economic development, prosperity. So really trying to advance almost that NEDLAC social and economic compact, if you will, in trying to bring different, I would say, groups together in order to advance this vision of an African Renaissance. We also note there's some continuity of this through the Zuma administration as well. And then we also noted that increasingly under the Zuma administration, the whole notion around human rights started becoming quite contested, which brings us now to the Ramaphosa era, where again, we see almost a little bit of a balancing act between advancing a moral position around human rights, and that was very, very clear through the South African engagement around the International Criminal Court of Justice and the Israel-Palestine situation. But also in the same breath, wanting to advance economic benefit, economic growth, investor confidence in South Africa, of course, but also, I would argue, Africa broadly. So with that very, very cursory overview of that, what can we learn from that, and linking that to public perceptions as well as the impact of the GNU? And I think for me, one of the key things that we do need to bear in mind is that when we start looking at a GNU context, one of the key principles of a GNU is collaboration and cooperation. So essentially, what we are looking at is a situation where parties with very different agendas may need to come together in order to cooperate. They may have very, very different ideological views, but will need to find some sort of common ground in order to cooperate and work with each other to facilitate that governance stability. Local government has given us quite a number of lessons on what administration and political instability can do if parties within a GNU or an elite compact or a coalition situation cannot find common ground. We have seen the effects on service delivery, on water provision, roads, potholes. We've heard all the public complaints, and Professor Graham also briefly alluded to those questions that we see decreasing public trust, which could, and it's going to be an interesting discussion, I think, going forward today, could possibly be linked to this view of, my life is not necessarily getting better. So if we accept that GNUs and our domestic politics have now very firmly moved towards a direction of collaboration, of cooperation, of needing to find common ground, of needing to find a common agenda around which to collaborate in a midterm period for 5 years in order to boost our societal well-being, to boost our investor confidence, for example, to try and facilitate investment and economic growth. It then begs the question, how would that shape our foreign policy and our foreign policy directives? And how is it that our domestic politics are going to shape our foreign policy directives and actions and priorities that we want to pursue? Now, I alluded very briefly that it was difficult for me to try and link these foreign policy priorities with the GNU context. And then it dawned on me that South Africa has, throughout our 30 years of democracy that we have been celebrating this year, advanced very much a soft power position on exactly building a global world built on human rights, on advancing cooperation, collaboration, and on finding common ground. And it's interesting for me to see that domestically at a local government level, and we still need to wait and see how this is going to play out within a national coalition context or elite pact context or GNU context, whichever terminology you prefer, whether our domestic politics will really cement in the global mind that we are a nation that can find common ground, that our political elites can work together in order to advance societal and economic well-being, to build public trust in a context where you have diversity, ideological, political, as well as very different views on what the policy priorities are. And this is quite important. If I consider our findings from the 2018 South African Foreign Policy Values and Priorities module that we had run, we found that South Africans look at foreign policy very much through a domestic lens. We look at some of the key issues that we feel are critical. Is very much protectionist in nature. It is around protecting South African businesses, priorities around controlling and reducing illegal immigration, priorities around protecting jobs of South African workers. So we find that there is this kind of protectionist lens that a GNU government will need to navigate on the one hand, but this protectionist lens also almost puts attention, I would say, on the GNU moving forward, thinking of the soft power and the image it wants to project to the globe around your Pan-African and humanitarian goals. It was quite interesting in our findings that approximately 2 to 3% of the South African population saw questions of gender equality and questions of climate change, for example, as critical foreign policy directives. And that's obviously quite a marginal number if, again, we consider the humanitarian and human rights approach that has very much informed South Africa's foreign policy. So if we consider this and we look at, I think I'm almost out of time, we look at the impacts of the GNU. Obviously, a big aim is to foster that cooperation between actors who have very different agendas. But I would take it further and argue that in building that cooperation, it actually presents South Africa with a very nice opportunity to actually build and cement its soft power based on that human rights approach, based on that cooperative and collaborative approach that it has taken, based on some of the interventions we have seen around human rights questions internationally. Now, inevitably, the ability to foster cooperation and to have effective collaboration is going to impact on effective policy making, and that includes also foreign policy. And here, I would argue it is critical. The world is very much in a state of transition or somewhat divided. If you will, we have noted conflict within the Middle Eastern region that has created quite a divisive line of either for or against, depending on who you support globally as well. And it is going to be critical for South Africa to try and navigate effective foreign policy making in a global context of instability and trying to maintain stability within its national government structures. And I think that would also have some very strong repercussions in terms of the soft power South Africa projects to the African continent, and in terms of achieving Pan-African goals, which includes helping to end conflict in Africa, helping to eradicate poverty in Africa, ensuring water sustainability in Africa, and programs to ensure universal education in Africa. That cannot be achieved if parties are unable to facilitate collaboration and cooperation domestically in order to project that image, so to speak, and build on that soft power globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kotze. I think I always forget as chair that I need to remind my presenters that they actually have an allotted time. And so I'm very glad that Vicky Graham could actually finish ahead of time. And Prof. Kotze, you did very well. I also think that Professor Graham actually laid the foundation quite nicely when she looked at what is fair democracy and trying to explain the various difficulties with explaining the concept of democracy, but the fact that she also tried to contextualize it within a South African context, which was really great. And then Professor Kotze, your presentation very nicely looked at it from a Pan-Africanist, but also a global perspective. So building very nicely on Professor Graham's paper. So thank you very much for that, and also for keeping within the time limit. Our next presenter is Professor Dirk Kotze. Thank you very much for being here, and he's from the Department of Political Science at UNISA. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. You might think that there's some form of conspiracy here between the people with the same surname. She has a double surname and I'm only Kotze here. We are not, as far as I know, we are not related. I'm going to speak about the theme of the session, of this particular session, that's about focusing on the domestic issues. And the government of national unity, as when this became very much public, and that is almost immediately after the 29th of May, the day of the election, there was also, and the negotiations started between the different parties of who's going to be part of this. Because the question was, is it a government of national unity that we are going to see it, or is it simply a coalition? And this debate between Fikile and Balula and Helen Zille about this. I think that without trying to be a mediator between them, it's actually both. It's not the either or. It's not either, it isn't just a government of national unity or just a coalition. And the government of national unity is, unfortunately, for people who think many things in South Africa are very unique, it's not unique. I have done some research about 10 years, well, in 2010 actually, and identified 7 types of governments of national unity all over the world. And I will not talk about them, but I will simply quickly summarize them. The first one is governments of national unity that's established to protect or consolidate the country against an external threat. And that is, for example, in the United Kingdom, Britain, during both world wars, the 2 main political parties were working together in one government as a war government, also a government of national unity. Sweden during the Second World War. Israel during the crisis of 2001. Second category is post-conflict, but before there's an election, to secure a political consolidation. It's part of, therefore, of a negotiated agreement. Macedonia, 2001. Afghanistan, 2001. Rwanda in 1992, and then from 1994 to 2000. Burundi, 2001. A third category is post-conflict, but elected to secure a political consolidation. So it's after the conflict and after there has been an election. South Africa, 1994, East Timor, 2001, Northern Ireland, 1998, Angola, 1994. Then the fourth one is when there's instability caused by economic or budgetary crisis. Before the unification of Germany, just within West Germany, between 1966 and 69, when they couldn't reach an agreement about the budget, and the 2 main parties had to come together. The fifth category is a government of national unity as a result of a failed government or electoral deficiency. Israel, 1984, when the Likud party and the Labour Party had to come together because they couldn't form another party. West Germany, between the 2 big parties in 1966 and 69. Then the government for agreement enforcement or peace building. It's after there's been a peace agreement negotiated, then how to establish a government of national unity to enforce that peace agreement. Macedonia, 2001, Afghanistan, 2001, South Africa, 1994, Rwanda, 1994, Burundi, 2001, Northern Ireland, Angola, East Timor. So you can see this is not something unique, something special, something that we have invented, something that there's users across the world, across different periods also. So we are using that, I would argue, maybe not because of this. I think not many people know about these things. And it's us as researchers who must be able to unearth them and to identify them. But it is very much because of, I would say, the experiences of 1994 here in South Africa. Now, how does it compare with 1994? The Government of National Unity in 1994 consisted of only 3 parties. Now we have 10. It was only the ANC, the New National Party, and the IFP. Part of the negotiated agreement is only parties with a support base of more than 10%. So if we had applied it to this one now, how many parties would have qualified? About 4. The others would not have qualified for a Government of National Unity. Another part of it was that it was negotiated only for 1 term of 5 years. So the idea was at least one of those, but even possibly both of those deputy presidents could come from another party, not from the party, the biggest party, therefore. So that is, I think, the memories that President Ramaphosa and John Steenhuisen and General Olomisa and others that they worked with when they negotiated or when they were involved in the negotiations about this Government of National Unity. Maybe I should say, where's the other big difference? In 1994, the ANC had 62%, so it was a majority party. It could govern on its own, but because of that negotiated agreement, as part of the transition, it was bound, constitutionally bound, by the interim constitution to implement this Government of National Unity. Now the ANC has 40%. So the ANC doesn't have a choice. It must have a coalition government. It can't govern on its own. It can't govern with 40%. It will lose all the votes in Parliament, if that's the case. So that is why it is a coalition, because a coalition exists when there's no party with a 50% plus 1 majority. And they need the support of other political parties in order to reach the cutoff line or the threshold of 50% plus 1. That's why I'm saying it's both. It's both a coalition because the ANC doesn't have the majority. It needs the other parties. That's the DA argument. And at the same time, it is a Government of National Unity because a coalition normally tries to keep it as small as possible, as close to 50% as 1 plus 1 as possible. Now the Government of National Unity is 70%. So it means it's much bigger than what is required. And that makes it a Government of National Unity. So what's the fundamental aspects about the Government of National Unity? What's the basis? What's the foundation that it has been laid in order to create the Government of National Unity that we have now? Just to keep time also. The first one is that at a very early stage, the statement of intent was agreed upon by the parties that became involved in the talks. And the statement intent laid down foundations about the values, the basic values that will be supported by all the parties that agreed to be part of such a formation, about decision-making power. And what it said about decision-making power is interesting because it goes partly back to 1994. And that is that the intention is that all decisions must be by consensus in the cabinet. But because there's 10 parties, it is possible that some parties in some cases are not going to agree. So what then? So the alternative is then to agree on the notion of sufficient consensus. Now, many of you are too young to understand what happened in 94 with sufficient consensus. And how someone like the late Pravin Gordhan was one of the key architects of this notion of sufficient consensus. And what sufficient consensus then meant, and what is meaning now again, is that if the most significant parties agree, then there's a decision. So in this case, they've made it actually explicit to say that if there's an agreement of 60% of all the members in the cabinet, then there's an agreement. The ANC and the DA together have 62%. So what does it mean? That if they struggle to agree within cabinet meetings, if the ANC and the DA agrees, there's an agreement. So that is the internal functioning of the government of national unity. And that has been agreed upon right in that first statement, that declaration of intent. Another important foundational event for the government of national unity was the cabinet Lekgotla that was held now a bit more than a month or so ago. And there, all the parties, all the DGs of the different departments, all the deputy ministers, all the mayors of the metros and other persons have come together in order to agree on a program of action for the government for the next 5 years. And what they've done apparently, and some of you who are working in government can maybe confirm it or not, but the way in which it has been reported, was that apparently the DGs of the different state departments went through all the election manifestos of the parties that are part of the government of national unity. And in that specific area, whether it's foreign affairs or home affairs or energy and electricity or what you can, education or so, they looked at what the different parties proposed as part of their election manifesto. Try to bring them together and see what type of convergence is there. To what extent is they are completely different, or is there a lot of commonality? Now, the percentage that I heard that they said, but maybe it's more for the public, is that they said about 80% of everything of the different parties converge. So this idea that there's this huge ideological differences, like the Bella Act and the National Health Insurance and some foreign policy matters, yes, there might be differences. But if you look at the total landscape of what government is dealing with in respect of everything, it's actually a few, yes, important, but only a few concepts where there's clear differences of understanding or of the points of departure in that respect. One thing which I think we are seeing today, I'm coming from Unisa, it's obviously in Pretoria, Tswane. So today is an important day there, because there's a new mayor. You in Johannesburg here are used to it. We also there to some extent, but the question is, what is the relevance of the government of national unity for a situation like that? And it looks like the answer is very little. That there is not this, what is being the dynamics of the government of national unity at national level and even at provincial level are different. And then at local level, completely different. So what is, for example, what in the part of the Western Cape, the southern part of it, there too, where all the beaches and the nice places are. In Oudtshoorn, for example, there the DA was in power. But the ANC and the Freedom Front Plus came together and adopted a motion of no confidence in the DA. They are all members of the government of national unity, remember that? And they put in place Freedom Front Plus, like in Ashton, Robertson or so, they did exactly the same. Now in Pretoria, the DA was in government, the ANC tabled a motion of no confidence, and today Action SA, which is not part of the government of national unity, has got the position of mayor. So where's the logic in all of this? When we talk about the government of national unity at local government level. The explanation for that is that the political dynamics, the political landscape differs from province to province and region to region. For example, in KwaZulu-Natal, the IFP is much more prominent than, for example, even here or in the Western Cape or the Northern Cape. So in KwaZulu-Natal, the IFP will be part of coalition governments, but not in the Northern Cape. Action SA is mostly represented here in Gauteng. They have almost no representation in Limpopo or the Western Cape or the Northern Cape or the Free State. So they won't play a role in terms of coalitions there at local level. So that's what I mean by this. Yeah? That the government of national unity, therefore, there cannot be mirror images of the government of national unity at all different levels. Take, for example, KwaZulu-Natal at provincial level. MK has received 45% the votes in KwaZulu-Natal. The ANC only 17%. nationally, the ANC receives 40% and MK 14%. So you can see again the differences. There, the government of provincial unity consists of the ANC, the DA, IFP, and NFP. MK with its 45% is not part of it. So the logic that the biggest party must be the leading party of coalitions doesn't apply. So I want to give you these sort of indicators of what is the significance of a government of national unity and how does it apply to different components of it. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip a number of things. The question about ideology versus pragmatism. I think this is a very important component of the discussion about government of national unity, whether it is for domestic policies or foreign international policies. The one point that is, I think, forgotten in the public discussion, but state officials will be very much aware of, is until next year, around about February, the government of national unity implements a budget which has been approved by the ANC before the election. So the budget of now cannot be a GNU budget. It's a budget that they inherited from the ANC. The policies that were implemented by the ANC before the election, most of them continue. That's a fact of life. Take the Bella Act. The Bella Act was steered through Parliament and adopted by Parliament before the election by Minister Angie Motshekga as the Minister of Basic Education. It was now signed after the election with a new minister who's from the DA. So if there's therefore differences of understanding about this legislation, then it is because it's a legacy. It's about inheritance. It's about policies that come from the previous dispensation that is now there at the moment. The national health insurance is, I would say, is exactly the same issue. What is interesting about the national health insurance, and why I'm mentioning this, is that contrast ideology versus pragmatism. Is that in the case of the Bella Act, President Ramaphosa said, okay, sections 4 and 5, problematic, let's park them for 3 months. Maybe have a discussion. That's pragmatic. It's not firm ideology to say, we are the biggest party, come, let's go. You are half of our size as the DA. You don't have any say in this. So that is what I start to pick up from the dynamics within the government of national unity. The national health insurance. One of the big issues is about private insurance, medical schemes. Many of you are members of it. I myself, I am, and many others, many at universities, at the public sector. So what's now the approach? They say, well, yes, it must be implemented over the long term. There's not money for it at the moment, but let's look at some of the big issues that are really the sticking points. So what is happening now is that's not the political parties of the government of national unity, which is saying, well, we want to negotiate in order to implement this and make it more workable. The same applies to that relationship between private-public partnerships. That's, I guess, one of the biggest movements in the ANC's, let's say, ideology, is this pragmatic approach to say, well, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the finances, it's not a developmental state with its own capacity. We have no choice. We have to use the public sector in terms of the ports, in terms of railway lines, in terms of energy, in terms of many things. And that brings it automatically closer to parties like the DA. So some form of convergence is taking place there, which is not by design. It is because of the political reality that this is taking place. Foreign policy is the same, and I know in the next session is only about foreign policy, so I'm not going to talk about that.
Can I give you a minute just
Yes,
to
yes.
find out?
Okay, so, but I want to give you one example, FOCAC, the Forum for Chinese African Cooperation that met very recently. Who was one of the most enthusiastic participants of it? John Steenhuisen, Minister of Agriculture, signed agreements with the Chinese about new markets for the agricultural sector. He's blossoming. Imagine that. Now, what's the future of the Government of National Unity? I'm going to give you just 3 points. In 2 years' time is the local government election. It will be a very good barometer of where the parties in the Government of National Unity will stand there. Some will grow, some will decline. And that will also maybe affect the dynamics within the Government of National Unity, even if they still work with the results of this election. 1 year after that, 2027, is the ANC's National Conference. That's the end of President Ramaphosa's term as ANC President. What then? He still has 2 years as the national president. We can talk about that, but that is an important component. So it's 26, 27, soon after each other. 29, the next national election and provincial election. Not so far, just 5 years from now. And that will then, I think, will give us even more of an indication of where we stand. I personally expect that the Government of National Unity will be a one-term government, 5 years. The next government from 29 will be smaller, still a coalition, but it might be what some call a grand coalition or simply an ordinary coalition. It will all be determined very much by what the MK party is going to be. Is it going to grow? Will President Zuma still be active in politics? If he's not active, what is going to happen to him? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Prof. I think that was really stimulating. So I'm going to open up for questions. You do have the colleague on hand, right? And we're going to, so we do have a Q&A right now. And perhaps just open up for questions, maybe taking questions in rounds of three. I think if you can, while you're thinking about your questions, when you do ask, you just identify yourself and also the organization, if possible. Thanks so much. Do you need the mic?
Hi, my name is Lisa Ott. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Johannesburg, and I also act as deputy director of the SACHI chair in African diplomacy and foreign policy. Mine is not so much a question as just a couple of reflections. And maybe it's a little bit reductive and maybe also idealistic, but I think there are just two things really that I wanted to reflect on. The first is that, you know, the ANC has been an ideologically bipolar party, and struggling this battle between which ideological line it wants to and can walk. And I think to some extent the creation of the MK party allowed it a little bit more freedom to find convergence with the DA, which I think in some ways was perhaps fortuitous at the time of the election. That's the first reflection. The second one is around the maturity of our democracy. And I think as Prof. Kotza has pointed out, you know, we don't actually have this really great track record of coalition governance at the kind of national level. And yet, you know, our kind of external levels of confidence in South Africa really went up with the announcement of this Government of National Unity. And I'd assume that that has to do with this notion of South Africa's democracy maturing, and the potential ability for us to overcome what are viewed as these kind of deep kind of chasms in our society to actually get down to business and be serious. And so I think that that is a lesson that we're going to need to learn in our political lives within the timeframes that Prof. Kotza has pointed out to the next national elections and then, first at the local elections and then coming to the national elections. And this is where the idealism perhaps enters a little bit, is just, and I reflect on this with respect to Pretoria as well, where you have a coalition, an agenda is agreed, and then people just suddenly renege on the agreements that they make for political reasons, for party political reasons and for personal reasons. and then still stand up and say, you know, as the new mayor said today, that she wishes to bring stability to the city. Well, I'm not sure how unseating a mayor who was just there for just more than a year brings much stability. So I think for me, what we need to find room for doing is finding the points of policy convergence, agreeing a plan of action, and then acting, and then allowing the people to decide in their elections whether they feel that these parties have acted in good faith or not. Have they brought about the changes that they said that they were going to make? And I think this is, you know, this notion of how we can translate this maturity of democracy at a national level, but also at an international level, is going to bring the points that Prof. Graham raised: public trust, but also investor confidence. And I think that's the question. How do we do that? And those are just my reflections. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much indeed, ma'am. I wish to thank the panelists and the attendees for the opportunity. My question is, looking at the ideological difference, particularly between ANC and DA, is South Africa ready to assume the rotational presidency of the G20 in December? And with that being said, how should it diplomatically apply its position to influence the geopolitical landscape amidst Russia-Ukraine war and escalating tension in the Middle East? And moreover, a possible seat in the UN Security Council. Thank you.
The third question, perhaps? Prof. Watson?
Thanks very much. Yes, I think the first point about, which is mainly a comment, is important, the points that are raised there, and especially the notion of trust. One of the big complications about trust is that it's not linked to particular parties. It's across the board. You know, some of the research by Afrobarometer and the HSRC and others indicate that Africans in public is across the board very low, including, for example, even something like one of the higher, but it's still around about only 38%. So the question of trust is something which I hope for everyone, both political parties, us as at universities are involved in sort of public discourses. It's exceptionally important to be able to deal with. And I think we, as where we are sometimes, as a point of view, negative. While if you look at, for example, what the Forum and other groups have done in terms of international surveys about how people outside South Africa are positive. Yeah. And it's much more hopeful than we as South Africans ourselves. So I think one has to, part of the problem, I've spoken with some senior people in government about it, is they communicate very poorly. They don't communicate their success stories. The public doesn't know about it. They don't know about the achievements. They don't know about things like the SKA in the middle of the Karoo. That's unique. It's only us in Australia, in the world. They don't understand how even things like the GNU is seen as almost a second miracle in South Africa. They don't appreciate that as one thing which I don't know, no one of you have spoken about it in public. I've mentioned it now once already. Is the fact that there was no violence after this election is an absolute major achievement. 6 January 2020, what was that? 2008 in Kenya or in Zimbabwe, what happened there? The Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, what happened there? If the president loses an election now in Venezuela, the supporters go to the street and say, no ways, we don't accept the election results. What happened here? ANC after 30 years in power, nothing. Is that not a major achievement for us, whether we talk about democracy, quality of democracy, consolidation of democracy, maturity, whatever you want to call it? It's something I mean, I know, many of you know it, that the police was deployed in the KZN for months. They are still there at the moment because of the fear of what could have happened after the election. It didn't. The ideological differences between the DA and the possibility for the presidents of the G20, I think in the next session that will be discussed. My point was the ideological differences are overstated. It's not so deep, these ideological differences. If we look at the political spectrum that is represented in the government of national unity across the 10 parties, it is right-wing, Freedom Front Plus, IFP, centrist, maybe you can say DA or Action SA is not there, and left. It includes even the PIC in the government of national unity. Well, the opposition is predominantly left. So although that means that the government of national unity is a whole spectrum, it's not only left or right. And I think that forces the party, all the parties, in order to find the middle point ultimately. But I think what we expect again is a type of overperformance of a cabinet and the coalition. If you speak to someone in the Netherlands or in Belgium or in Germany or so, that all have coalitions and know only coalitions, they know it's the politics of compromises. You can't implement everything you want as a political party. You go in there based on your support that you've received at an election, and then you go there and try to find the middle ground with other parties so that you can be part of the government. That's the bottom line. So to try to accommodate all interests and all ideologies in the government of national unity is simply unrealistic. It never happens anywhere in the world. We can't expect our them to do the same.
Stan Kotzer, do you have any comments to add?
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting and very enriching discussion, because I mean I completely agree that dealing with political parties, and I have highlighted this in some of our previous research as well, where
that we very often look at the role players of the GNU as almost being ideologically cohesive internally. We tend to forget about some of the factional dynamics and leadership struggles that also impact on the ability of, key thing moving forward, that within the public imagination, both domestically as well as internationally, to what extent the ability of the GNU partners, the coalition partners, to really build on that politics of compromise and advance societal well-being and economic well-being is going to role. From a foreign policy perspective, I think domestically as well, you will very often find that there might be some disagreement on foreign policy priorities, foreign policy positions that should be taken, again, as I had mentioned, in a global context of instability, of increased polarization, of very divisive hardline positions emerging around key global developments. It is going to be, I think, quite a tough ground for South Africa to navigate when domestically we are working on the politics of compromise, but globally we do need to put up this almost front of success. And I quite like what Professor Kotze had said around the overperformance, that kind of cemented an idea in my head. Are we as South Africans slightly overachieving? Do we need to be kinder to ourselves when we start looking and engaging at the questions of compromise as well?
Thanks. Thank you so much, Prof. I'm not sure if we have time for another round of questions. Okay, so I'm told you can go ahead. We don't need to share the mic, right?
No, I can just ask, no problem.
Good. Thank you very much.
Senator Sanbonelli,
Dr. Malusi Mngube. My question to Dr. Kosia particularly. Personally, I strongly believe using the word government in context, I don't think in South Africa there was a government of national unity. I think it was an elitist arrangement, those who have power. And what we basically did, I would like the professor's impression, what we basically did is to postpone the type of problem we're sitting about. And I can reference this from what former President Mbeki said, that South Africa's economy is racialized and is polarized between the black poor and the white rich. And actually up to now, they're getting richer. And with the geopolitical tensions that's happening, basically, there is no money to grow the South African economy. If you look at the statistics right now, unemployment has actually increased. So yes, I contend that it's an elitist arrangement, call it whatever you like. I don't think it's a government of national unity. I think it's a coalition, a pragmatic plan, just in case. And that went a long way into stopping white man camp, because I think when they did analysis, they knew that it might erupt. So Professor, what do we do? Or can you assure some of us that there is no danger that this postponement that keeps on going, at one time it will erupt and South Africa will not be able to control it? I believe this was not a miracle. Yes, they took a calculated measure to temper down and to simmer down the contradictions that are there. But those contradictions are reaching critical mass given the global political power shifts. We can see what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in the DRC. South Africa does not have the blessings of exceptionalism. At some point in time, we now have many highly educated Black people, graduates, matrics. We are sitting on the tinderbox, are we not, Professor? I don't think this is a government of national unity. It's just elitists that have just managed to manage it, and they manage it every day. Thank you. That's my question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mngube. Prof. Nganje.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Professor Kotze. I think my question is somehow related to Lucy's comment and question. Professor Kotze, you have this optimistic reading of the GNU based on what you call the politics of compromise and pragmatism. I'm just wondering, would you mind perhaps reflect on the political cost of this compromise and pragmatism that will have to take place within the GNU, bearing in mind that even within parties like the ANC, not everyone is in favor of the GNU. So what are the costs when they engage? Because at some point, people will have to move from their ideological positions to satisfy the partners. What are the political costs for the parties and for the country?
Thanks so much, Prof. Nganje.
Thanks very much. I think both questions are speaking to each other or very much related. Governments are always elitist. That's the definition what the government is. It's not direct it's not direct democracy like in the ancient times. We have parliaments, that's already an elite. Then within parliament there's a select group that's the majority party, that's another level of elitism. And then within that majority party there's a group that's the cabinet. That's the top level of elitism. How else? How are we going to govern? We are lucky we have a relatively small population, but if you are in India, how are you going to govern without elites? You are in China, the Communist Party is an elite party. Only 10% of the people of China are members of the Communist Party. So politics in a representative form is by definition leads towards elitism. It's unavoidable. Otherwise, we will have to have local laws and so on all the time, and we will be all the time busy. We will have to take decisions all the time, and we won't be able to do our individual professions and work. So I think it's a question about what is possible and what is not possible. Yes, I understand that ideal concept of how the public and everyone must be involved in decision making. But unfortunately, that most people don't today for public participation. How many of you, for example, are involved in a ward committee in your ward? How many of you are participating when there's a call in the national parliament that there's now a new process, a panel to reform or to investigate the reform of our electoral system? How many participate in that? How many are, when there's a bylaw here in Johannesburg that is being renewed or considered by the council, how many of you participate in the public participation opportunities for that? Almost no one. So that notion of public participation is ideal, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in practice in many instances. So I think that this is something where idealism or the ideal versus very practical considerations have to meet each other at some point. Now, I think the real question is that the fundamental changes of our societal structures, specifically socio-economic, that hasn't happened yet. So the question is, how will that happen? Is there any government under the current conditions, which is sort of, let's say in a very broad terms, democratic, or liberal democratic, you might say, able to do that? It looks like at the moment, no. That's maybe the reality. That for that to be achieved, which the two questions I think presume, actually requires a complete overturn of society. And yes, that is an option, but there's interest in society that's going to fight back, including the middle class, and that's basically us. So that's the reality where we are sitting. But so what is one of the most important agents of change? Is where we are here, universities, for example, schools. Because it sounds like it's divorced from reality, but the official statistics of SAs is that the graduate unemployment in South Africa is only about 7%. Is that correct or not? We don't know. But if it is, then it confirms that universities and other educational institutions is really an agent of change. I hope that's true.
Thank you so much. I think, when we discussed the government of national unity, and I have noted this before as well, it is true that we are looking at an elite pact. There wasn't a referendum that engaged everybody and asked them, who do you want to cooperate with, or who do you believe your party should cooperate with? I think what will be quite interesting to see is to test that with our next rounds around the South African Social Attitude Survey. Because we do ask questions of political affinity. How close do you feel to your political party? How strongly do you believe that your political party can help you, and so forth? So I think it's going to be interesting to see if there has been an effect around an elite coalition vis-a-vis questions of political affinity, which would link into the political cost of a GNU in terms of support. Just bearing in mind as well, I think, and this is my final reflection, I think we are over time here, is that, we're having discussions, and again, within, I would say, a global context where we find very hard positions emerging. And those hard positions very often do not see the possibilities for compromise and for sustainability. And I will use the example of what I had presented on, which is the question of climate change. Climate change is possibly one of the most critical issues that is affecting the youth, not today, but the youth of 2050, the youth of 2055. So I think somewhere we also, when we set our foreign policy priorities, when we look at our domestic policies, we are very much in the now, in the expediency of it. And our local politics reflect that. But we do need to also start thinking strategically, what is the world going to look like in 2050, for example, and what will be the big issues then? And how can we best leverage what we have now in order to be able to effectively respond to that world?
Thank you very, very much, Professor Steyn-Kotze. I really appreciate your comments. And to all the speakers this afternoon, I think you really provided quite a stimulating discussion and a very nice sort of review about the GNU and domestic politics, which then sets the scene very nicely for the next section about GNU and foreign policy. But I'm going to hand over to Dr. Teller to just take us through to the next section. Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you for the presentations.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wagner, and thanks to the distinguished speakers. You will agree with me that it's been a very robust and thought-provoking conversation here. This panel has carefully and brilliantly engaged the impact of the GNU on domestic politics. Now, the next panel will focus on the foreign policy dimension of the topic. And the chair of the panel is Professor Fritz Nganje, who is the head of the Department of Politics and International Relations here at UJ. Prof, bless you.
Okay, is it afternoon or evening? Many can do. Okay, thanks so much, the panelists for the first session who've laid a good foundation for the next session that looks at the implications of the GNU for South Africa's foreign policy and international relations. So recently, most of the observation or analysis has been that because the foreign ministry remains in the hands of the ANC, the minister and the deputy ministers, they are all part of the ANC. The suggestion is that we are not going to see any change in the foreign policy direction of the country. But there have been other analysts who've suggested that foreign policy is not shaped exclusively by the foreign ministry or the presidency, that you have other departments through their multilateral and bilateral engagements that also shape a country's foreign policy. And the DA in particular is in control of some of these departments. So the assumption that because the foreign ministry remains in the hands of the ANC, then there wouldn't be any major implications for the country's foreign policy may be misplaced. I think Professor Kotze has equally clearly outlined that there is an expectation that decisions within cabinets are made through consensus or sufficient consensus. And if you have these other parties like the TA within cabinet, it means they also have an opportunity, not only within cabinet, but in parliament as well, to influence the foreign policy direction of the country. So the next panel is going to reflect on these issues, to ask the question whether what we saw in Beijing, what our proposal referred to as John Steenhuisen's Damascus moment, whether that is a reflection of what we're going to see, that, as Professor Kotze has pointed out, that out of pragmatism and compromise, you have certain parties that will move closer to the ANC's position when it comes to foreign policy. Or are we going to see the G and other parties try to use their presence in government to shape and to some extent complicate South Africa's foreign policy? So to help us make sense of this, we have three speakers. The first is Professor Gomezulu, from the University of the Western Cape. And I think he's going to be the first speaker. And then we have Mr. Lay from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And there's supposed to be a third speaker, Professor Graham, not Vicky this time, Susie Graham, but apparently she's caught in some commitment, but she will join us if by the time we've gone through the first two speakers, she has finished her meeting. So let's proceed with Professor Gomezulu, who will join us online.
Yes, Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity. In the interest of time, Chair, let me then start with the formalities so that by the time we start, then I don't have to do that again. First of all, I appreciate the invitation and I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues, having heard what my other colleagues have said on the issues of domestic policy. I phrased my presentation taking a cue from the theme, the broader theme of this webinar, and I titled it the GNU and the Future of South Africa's Foreign Policy, Prospects and Challenges. The reason why I titled it this way was in anticipation of the optimism of Professor Kotze, who thinks that we have done a lot in terms of taking this country forward. Of course, trying to undo the pessimism that most of us have about our leadership, what I normally refer to as having a leadership deficit, which has brought us to where we are. But that's a story for another day. Let me then cut to the chase in the interest of time. Let's go to the introductory remarks, where I start off by saying that coalition governments are naturally complex. I think we got this also from the previous session, where we say that having a coalition government is not a simple thing. Of course, it's a complex political arrangement which needs leadership prowess. In the absence of leadership prowess, there is no way that we can sustain a coalition. If based on a shaky foundation characterized by trust deficit, or if badly managed, such coalitions are bound to collapse. Then the question all of us have to ask ourselves is, with our current leadership, are we better positioned to sustain this coalition? I had an opportunity to have a discussion with the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture, Honorable Mackenzie, who is passionate about this and even says that, in fact, South Africans will see the success of this GNU, as they call it, to the extent that they will even be willing to give them another chance for another 5 years. Whether that will happen or not, that's a story for another day. So in a country like South Africa, which has one party dominance, that is the ANC, since 1994, a coalition government at a national level is unprecedented. Other colleagues have already mentioned this. In other words, we have never had an opportunity or a chance to have a coalition government at a national level. We've seen this in other areas, except the special arrangement we had in 1994, which was trying to massage the context of the time, that is trying to bring the nation together. And it was meant to end in 1999. Since 1994, South Africa's foreign policy has been crafted in a particular way, which was not divorced from the country's beleaguered history. In other words, the manner in which our foreign policy has been crafted since 1994 was basically applying or implementing the mind of the ANC's thinking, not necessarily the other parties like UDA and others that are now part of this coalition. So which means that for now, we are doing things differently. With the new development of coalition politics occasioned by the outcome of the 2024 general election, the ANC has been forced to work together with other political parties. Professor Kotze mentioned at this point that it wasn't a matter of choice. The ANC had no choice but to work with other political parties, given the fact that for the first time in its 30 years of existence in this new political era, they then got less than 50%, 40% to be exact. So therefore, they were forced to form a coalition. Not all political parties, of course, embraced South Africa's foreign policy agenda before the election. You can go back to how parties were contesting, and they were saying that they disagree with the ANC on many of the foreign policy position. The question then will be, what will happen now? So I'm asking two questions. One has to do with the results of the election, which have compelled us to do things differently, and then whether this will work or not. And then, of course, what does the so-called GNU mean for the country's foreign policy direction? You can move to the next slide. I'm saying so-called advisedly and deliberately, because I strongly believe that what we now call a coalition government is actually not a coalition. I mean, what we call a GNU is actually not a GNU. And I will definitely corroborate the statement by Dr. Ngube there. There are key concepts that need to be clarified at the outset. One is foreign policy, of course, which is an area of international relations which explores how states interact either with one another or with non-state actors. It is the handmaiden of a domestic policy. In other words, there is a direct relationship between foreign policy and domestic policy. I'm glad that we started with domestic policy before moving to this one. Now we come to the next one, coalition. A coalition is a form of government which is formed when two or more political parties temporarily work together to achieve a common goal. It is the contract-like a political agreement. In other words, those parties that come together, they have a contract that are going to work together to achieve a common goal. Of course, historically, it traced back to the Latin word coalitas, which means to grow together. The assumption is that the parties that agree to work together are going to basically move the country forward, working side by side. There comes then GNU. The definition of a GNU is that it is a special type of a coalition, that is where then I'll slightly differ from Professor Kotze, that a GNU and coalition are one and the same thing. In my view, they are different in the sense that a GNU is a special type of a coalition. Although it does not have to include all parties represented in government, but it must include all major political parties which govern as a collective. Then the question is, does South Africa have a GNU? My answer is an emphatic no. If you look at the results of the 2024 general election, you have parties that performed in a particular way and which are therefore supposed to be part of the GNU. Just quickly, the ANC got 40, the DA got 21, MK Party got 14, and the EFF got 9. Then, of course, I've struck a line there because the IFP got 3. But miraculously, the IFP is part of the so-called GNU, and the MK part with 14 is not part of that, and the EFF with 9 is not part of that. Now, the question is, do we have a GNU? My answer is no. We don't have a GNU. Instead, we have a multi-party coalition, which is correct, but not necessarily a GNU. Then we have another type, which is called confidence and supply agreement. This one is slightly different in the sense that it is a form of a minimal coalition where parties agree to support the decision of the majority party to pass a motion of no confidence, elect a president or premier, depending where it exists, pass budget and all of that. Some examples might be what we've seen in Tswana, where Silver Springs being removed after the motion was raised by the ANC, and then other parties came into the picture. I then have other examples globally, which I'm not going to dwell on. Let's move on to the next slide, please, where we then look at these types of coalitions just to get a sense of where we are, so at least we can plug ourselves and see where we belong. The establishment, or to establish if South Africa is indeed currently governed by a coalition or a multi-party coalition, we have to consider the following types. One, we have a pre-election, post-election coalition type. In other words, there are instances where parties would agree before an election that after the election we are going to form a coalition. We've seen this happen in countries like Australia, India, Denmark, and many others. So they agree upfront. Then others don't agree before the election, but they only agree after the election, even if there is a party that has won, or if there is no outright winner, then they agree on a coalition. Then the second type is an inclusive coalition. An inclusive coalition then will be epitomized by what we call government of national unity. The one we had in 1994, where we said, regardless of who wins the election, then that party will have to form a coalition, and that was enshrined in the interim constitution of 1993. Then the third one is coalition of bigger parties with divergent political ideologies, which we call a grand coalition. In the South African context, this would have been a coalition between the DA and the ANC. because there are two bigger parties, and in some instances, there are ideological differences. Then this would have been a grand coalition. The fourth one is coalition of smaller parties, which people normally refer to as minority coalitions, even if you don't get the outright majority, but then will come together and then will constitute government. Then the last type, which is type 5, coalition of parties and or individuals, what is called a bare majority coalition, where you bring together both political parties and some individuals in order to make sure that you have the majority, which is the 50+1, for you to be able to take decisions. Let's go now to the next heading. Coalition government and prospects about South Africa's foreign policy direction. In other words, we're looking at what would make this coalition work, what then our politicians call a government of national unity. One advantage about the current coalition government is that it is possible to implement meritocracy. In other words, where people are appointed into positions based on their requisite skills and knowledge, not necessarily because of their party affiliation, or in the case of the ANC, because they belong to a quote-unquote correct faction. Because there are people who belong to a wrong, quote-unquote, wrong factions, but who have the requisite skills and knowledge, but have been sidelined. This happens when, in fact, this cadre deployment is implemented wrongly. There is nothing wrong with cadre deployment in my view. I've made this statement both in the country and abroad, where we're saying that there is nothing wrong about cadre deployment, but the problem is how it is implemented, where you take someone who knows nothing and then you say that person must either be a minister or deputy minister. That's a recipe for disaster. Foreign policy documents are likely to consider different scenarios and revisit relations with certain countries that were previously ignored. In other words, now that we have this coalition, you have other minds that are different from yours, and then we are likely to bring those together and then come up with something slightly different. Reflections on and then reviews of foreign policies will be possible. They can sit together and then decide where do we make some changes and where do we retain the status quo. New ideas will be placed on the table for consideration by the collective. In other words, it's no longer the ANC deciding what to do, what the foreign policy position of the country will be, but it's the ANC together with all other political formations that are part of this coalition. And then foreign policy inconsistencies are also likely to be addressed. We can move to the next slide. Basically, in 2020, when I published that book, my argument was there have been concerns that our foreign policy position has been inconsistent in the sense that we remember what happened in 1998 when we refused to send our soldiers to the DRC, arguing that our foreign policy agenda was built on a soft power approach, as Professor Steenkotze said. But then the argument is that maybe we are using the smart power approach, which is a combination of both the soft power and hard power. Because in the same year, 1998, we sent soldiers to Lesotho. Then the question is, where was our soft power at that point? But then let's move on to this heading then, coalition government and potential challenges. In other words, I'm mindful of the fact that there are things that are positive about this coalition arrangement, but there are things that are most likely to create us some challenges. One is that there is no doubt that the ANC and the DA hold divergent views on many foreign policy positions. This was the case before the 2024 general election, and in fact, even this time around, you'll find that there will be some differences, even though they are trying to find one another. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine and Israel's attack on Palestine are just some of the examples wherein the ANC and the DA have taken different positions. It's not for me to go back and recount what happened, what Steenhuisen did and said, and what the president did and said. We know that for a fact, then we can engage during discussion time. The decision by the DA to contact the American government directly and not via DECO, as should be the case, is a recipe for disaster for this coalition called the GNU, because you cannot bypass a governing party. In this case, the ANC is no longer the governing party, but is the leader of the coalition government. So the question then will be, will the DA abide by the rules and say the ANC is still leading this coalition, or will the DA say what Helen Zille said on several occasions, reminding the ANC, by the way, you did not win the election, therefore you cannot take a unilateral decision. So those are some of the things that we'll be watching with a keen interest. The 10 political parties that are part of the coalition government have different constituencies whose needs are also diverse. So this will be factored into the foreign policy discussions because they will be representing their own constituencies. All ministers are appointed by the president and they don't necessarily associate themselves with political parties. But in all probability, given what has been happening, I argue that the temper tantrums of the DA raise questions about obedience of some ministers who may put their party, the DA, first before the country, even though they know that they were not appointed by Steenhuisen as the leader of the DA, but they were appointed by the president invoking Section 84 of the Constitution. But some of them may find themselves more answerable to their party than to the country, which will then cause some problems when these foreign policy positions are taken. Let's move to the next slide, please. I'm almost done, Chairperson. Basically then, given all that I've said, in conclusion, I argue that foreign policy making is a complex process that, as I said at the beginning, it is informed by the country's domestic policy. You first look at your domestic policy, and then from there you build your foreign policy agenda, which is why in realism, we are told that realism is in fact state-centric, in the sense that everything revolves around the state. So the state before entering any agreement, be it in a bilateral nature or multilateral institutions, they will first look at their domestic policies and then they will have then a chance to formulate their foreign policy. A country that is governed through a coalition needs leaders who do not suffer from political parochialism when drafting a foreign policy. In other words, we don't draft a foreign policy that will be relevant today and then tomorrow it becomes irrelevant. So a foreign policy agenda that is drafted, of course, it will be reviewed at some point, but then those drafters must make it a point that they cast their eyes in the future and not necessarily be confined on the current situation, which might change anytime. South Africa has a multi-party government, not a government of national unity. I'll be happy to engage on that one. With political maturity, the 10 parties can work together to improve South Africa's foreign policy, unless, of course, they are confined into their own spaces, then we'll have a problem. Should they put their individual parties' interests first before those of the country, South Africa's future foreign policy will face serious challenges. So basically, the onus is on our political parties and their leaders and the membership to put the interests of the country first, as opposed to putting party interests first. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Nkombezulu. I just need to correct that he's with the Nelson Mandela University, not the UWC, as I had erroneously pointed out. So from an academic, we'll move over to a practitioner. We'll invite Mr. Zayi Lai, who is the Chief Director of United Nations Political Peace and Security at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation.
Thank you very much to the Institute for the kind invitation. Specifically also for inviting Dirko. I think it's very useful when we have these engagements and we are also given an opportunity to speak to you on this very interesting topic. I wanted to start off reflecting what South African foreign policy priorities are. In his State of Nation address in February, President Ramaphosa outlined South Africa's foreign policy approach, and he went into some detail on some of the priority areas for the government. He inter alia noted that we remain committed to playing a constructive role on our continent and around the globe for the realization of what the last 30 years the governments have consistently said, that we want a better Africa and a better world. Better South Africa, better Africa, and a better world. The president stated that we will continue to play an important role, particularly on the continent, to silence the guns and to work towards the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. On the Russia-Ukraine conflict, he mentioned that we will continue to engage in peace process, including the African Peace Initiative. He also stated that, guided by the fundamental principles of human rights and freedom, we have taken up the Palestinian cause to prevent further deaths and destruction in Gaza. We will use our foreign policy to pursue our development goals. This includes pursuing these interests in the formations we belong to, including the BRICS and the G20, which we will preside over in 2025. I wanted to mention this because that is a reflection of what our foreign policy priorities are. And as was stated by the previous speaker, our foreign policy is a reflection, or should ideally be a reflection, of our domestic policy. It is also a reflection of who the country is, where it is located, and where we come from. The foreign policy priorities spelled out in the SONA that I began with reflects precisely this. It reflects the fact that democratic South Africa is a country that emerged from centuries of colonialism and decades of apartheid. It is a country which is physically placed in Southern Africa, on the African continent, and is also part of the larger developing world. This does not change, despite the fact that we have a government of national unity. Who we are and what we are does not change. I will approach this discussion on the government of national unity and the future of South Africa's foreign policy, not of course as a politician, but rather as a practitioner, which I am. I will reflect on what we have been doing since the start of the current administration and our plans in the coming months. So as I said, since 1994, focus on the African continent, there's been a focus on the African continent, on solidarity with the global South, and multilateralism, broadly, working collectively with other countries. These have been the key features of our foreign policy. We have consistently espoused and acted on our commitment to collective action and encouraged more voices to be heard in search of solutions to address global challenges. We recognize that no single country, no matter how powerful and wealthy, can seek to assume for itself the global unilateral monopoly on seeking solutions for the world's problems. The global system should be based on common and shared values and be fully inclusive of all the nations of the world. It should set norms and standards that we should find universal application without exception, and should be at the service of humanity and not the narrow interests of the few. To accomplish greater international cooperation and a commitment to collective action, we need to cultivate greater levels of trust between states so that there is less confrontation and contestation. This is necessary in dealing with our responses to global health crisis, addressing armed conflict, eliminating nuclear weapons, or addressing the impact of climate change. We've constantly stressed that because of global mistrust, we often tend to work at odds, or countries often tend to work at odds with each other, undermining each other's positions rather than pulling in the same direction for greater good. These key aspects that I've outlined were the messages that underpinned our participation recently by the President and our Foreign Minister and the South African delegation broadly, which included ministers across different political parties that make up the GNU at the recently held general debate of the General Assembly in New York. In his statement to the General Assembly, President Ramaphosa reflected on the creation of the GNU. And he basically said that the 10 political parties have come together around a common agenda for economic growth, job creation, poverty eradication, and sustainable development. And in the various discussions we had with delegations across the world during the General Assembly, there was interest in the fact that South Africans were once again able to come together across political party lines to work together, to manage our differences, and work in tandem in the areas of commonality. This is a lesson general for member states across the UN system, particularly at the time when there's mistrust and lack of cooperation to ensure that we're able to come together in addressing global challenges. So there are questions as to whether there will be changes to any of these areas of focus of government. I think that's the question that has been raised, and that particularly would be the area you'd want to engage on. The foreign policy engagements over the last few months have illustrated that the principles underpinning South Africa's foreign policy over the last 30 years continue to be at the heart of our engagements. So over the last few months, since the formation of the Government of National Unity, we have continued our engagements at the African Union, focusing on Africa's integration and focus on particularly on the second 10-year implementation of Agenda 2063, which is the blueprint of Africa's development. Members of the GNU have also been participating in partnership forums with our bilateral partners and across the world. This is across the world. We've had bilateral engagements with countries as varied as China, the United States, Japan, and others. This has not changed from what we have been doing before. At the General Assembly in New York, President Ramaphosa participated in the Summit of the Future, where the Pact of the Future was adopted. This is a pact, as you may be aware, that focuses on forging a new global consensus for the international community to be prepared for future threats and challenges. The President also participated in the General Assembly, where he advocated for stronger, more representative multilateral systems to address global challenges. We also participated in meetings of the BRICS coalition and also on meetings of the G20, which, as I indicated, we will chair over the next year. There was a question on the G20, and perhaps I should look at that specifically. As I indicated, we will take over the chair, and the chairship will pass from Brazil to South Africa in December. This will be the culmination of a series of developing countries chairing the G20. We had Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then South Africa before the G20 chairship is handed over to a developed country. The United States takes over the chairship of the G20 following South Africa's chairship in 2025. The focus of South Africa will be particularly on development. In our attempt at focusing the G20 towards making a meaningful contribution to addressing the poly crisis that we face, South Africa has adopted the theme solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. These, no doubt, resound with our national triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So essentially, we will be taking over the chair of the G20, and we have already worked on the strategy in terms of what the approach will be, and this has already begun to be implemented as we take over the chairship at the first Sherpa meeting of the G20 in December in Pretoria. On Ukraine, Russia, which I think is one area which has come up in the discussions we've had, there seems to be a feeling that perhaps our approach would alter. South Africa's approach from the time this particular crisis began in February 2022, when Russia went into Ukraine, is a approach that we have developed over that time and have continued to advocate. It is based on, as you're aware, on a call for diplomacy and political dialogue as the only path to sustainable and peaceful resolution to the conflict. We have been particularly concerned about the regional and international ramifications of the conflict, including on global food and energy supplies. We as a country have been able to engage both sides of the conflict, and we are one of the, in a somewhat unique situation. There are very few countries that are able to do this. Last June, for example, when President Ramaphosa was part of the African Peace Initiative, and we visited Kiev in Ukraine, within a few hours, he was able to go to St. Petersburg and engage with President Putin. So there are very few countries and very few regions like that of Africa that have the ability to do this, that would be welcomed in both capitals and be engaged upon on what our views are on ending the conflict. South Africa remains part of several peace initiatives aimed at resolving the conflict in Ukraine, including the African Peace Initiative, which I mentioned, but also the Ukraine Peace Formula, which is a Ukrainian peace formula that was developed by President Zelensky. And recently, we've also joined a group of countries of the Global South working towards de-escalating the conflict. On the situation in the Middle East, the principled approach that democratic South Africa has adopted over the last 30 years, calling for the end of Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory and the creation of an independent Palestinian state living side by side with the state of Israel, is one that has remained unchanged. South Africa is also continuing with its action at the International Court of Justice, and there were questions raised about that as to whether this matter will continue. By the end of this month, our legal team will submit its memorial, which is our substantive arguments based on evidence, which will be presented to the court or outline our legal case. So I thought I should reflect on some of these specific practical examples where over the last few weeks and months since the creation of the GNU, we have seen a consistent approach of our foreign policy, which resonates with, as I started off my address with, it resonates with who we are as an African country that is part of the developing South, that has at its key interest addressing our domestic challenges and that of the larger developing world. The question will be whether that will change. As I said, the fact that we remain a developing country with these challenges will not change. And the approach that we have adopted on all these issues that I've mentioned is a consistent approach based on values, and most importantly, based on the values that are reflected in the Constitution of the Republic. So ultimately, the focus has been on the priorities that define the foreign policy of democratic South Africa, and which has been developed over the last 30 years. I think I'll stop there. I know I've not taken too much time, but I think it's better if we get into some kind of discussion on this, Professor. I hope that's useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lai. We do not have a Professor Graham yet, so we can open up for Q&A and discussion on the two presentations. We'll take a round of three.
Sorry, I have a question for the representative from DERCO who just presented. I want to ask about the foreign policy and also South Africa as a foreign policy and whether or not it is consistent, because it is the same country that mounted this case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, because the premise obviously being that Israel is perpetrating genocide and it is occupying Gaza. But it is also a country, it is also South Africa, I mean, it's also a country that has been very inconsistent. Because on the other hand, you seem to have taken this equivocal or dubious role, so to say, in the Russian-Ukraine war. I mean, this is also Putin. I think no one can really argue against the fact that his design is over the occupation of Ukraine, which started, by the way, with the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. So what exactly is South Africa's foreign policy regarding the occupation of one sovereign country by another? Thank you.
Dr. Malusi Mncube. My first question is, like all the previous speakers correctly said, is foreign policy of a country is informed by its domestic policy. And within South Africa's domestic policy, I would argue documents that have played a part into South Africa's domestic policy, it could be the 1955 Freedom Charter, it could be the BEE, and the National Development Plan. And the crux in all, the common thread in all of that, it's reclaiming the land, the minerals, industrial complex, and number three, to make sure that we control the Reserve Bank and we control the commercial banks, and there is job creation. But what has happened is that the leadership speaks left, but it walks right. So the leadership since 1994, they are sorted out, and there's more people who are unemployed. So we have a dichotomy here, whereby, again, I'm going back to the elites are sorted out, and the common people, the majority, specifically the black majority, are not sorted out. And our foreign policy, yes, in terms of supporting PLO, what's happening in Gaza, in the DRC, and peace plan, that is fine, and I support that. But in terms of job creation, I would like to ask any of the scholars and Mr. Lear, also practically, what have you done, especially against a global economy that is not growing, specifically for Africa, which is still a resource exporting country, no beneficiation, no jobs that we are creating, qualitative, productive jobs. I'm not talking about casualized jobs. We have total when it comes to number one. Number two, I want to ask on the issue of the to Mr. Lear, also from the DERCO. He spoke about Agenda 2063. I think why the African Union is not moving. When you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union, it recognizes the sovereignty of each country. So it's an intergovernmental organization. When are we, or what efforts are being made that on certain aspect, at least, whether it's having one currency or one central bank, what efforts to date we have a supracontinental authority to be able to enforce certain regulations so that African Union can start moving, because right now there is no movement. Ibrahim Traore is even saying, was African Union, we might leave the United Nations, we might leave the African Union. So what efforts to date has the African Union made to say, at least on this front, we are getting closer to having a supra-continental authority to enforce rules that are binding, so that we don't just become a talk shop, because up to now it's a talk shop. Hence Israel was even had an observer status that saw the lividness of the past foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, who had to work very hard and make sure that Israel was ejected out of the African Union. So what has our foreign policy done to make sure we have a supra-continental authority in a certain aspect, so that we can have some traction, not just a talk shop? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, good evening. My name is Lovemore. So I just want to emphasize and highlight on what my colleague said about the consistency, because I think it's something which is of, I felt sad, when you look at it. So I wanted to bring it to SADC. So when you look at the role which the South African government play, and their power, influence and everything, there are a lot of things which they could do, and then there are a lot of challenges which need to be resolved. So firstly, the issue of migration. So it's a topical issue, and we saw previous elections, they run on one ticket of migration, and they tend to demonize the vulnerable migrants who come from those countries. But then they overlook the push factor, some of the things which push those migrants from those countries. So, for example, economic instability, no rule of law, human rights abuses in some of the regional countries. But then the SADC treaty says there are certain principles like those, the upholding of human rights, democracy, the rule of law. And most of the countries where most of the migrants come from, they haven't complied with those principles and values of SADC. And then you have got South Africa, which is so influential, whose constitution says our conduct should also be in line with the constitution. So then in terms of our policy, we have seen our leaders going to embrace or maybe legitimize or give credibility to some of the leaders in the region who are maybe perpetrating or maybe not complying with the principles and values of SADC, of which if we had taken a consistent role as we did with Israel and what my colleagues suggest we should do also with Russia. So then we have like a region where we can manage some of the things like migration. So please help us, update us on that. Are we consistent? What are we doing? Because it's really sad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. No, we'll come back to you. Let's get the speakers respond to these questions. Professor Ngomezulu, you want to go first?
No problems. I can start, Prof. Maybe I'll leave out the first question because it was directed at my colleague from DECO. I'll go straight to the question that was raised by Dr. Ngube with regards to saying one thing and then doing the other. And the main question asked with reference to the AU is, why does the AU not have teeth to bite? The answer is very simple. The compartmentalization of the continent into Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and Lusophone Africa is the main pandemic, in my view. Because what happens is our heads of state meet in Addis Ababa and they agree on certain things that need to be done. But immediately after that meeting, they have calls coming from the former colonizers and then obviously the implementation part does not happen simply because there are other deals that are made outside of the formal meeting. You saw this with the election of the AU chair when Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was contesting the position. The African continent was not divided in terms of what was presented by the contestants, but basically they were grouping themselves in terms of who their erstwhile colonizers were. Given that context, therefore, it's not easy for the continent to implement the very good policy positions that they've adopted for the simple reason that in a way, they are still answerable to their erstwhile colonizers, which is a sad reality, unfortunately. Then the last comment will be in response to Lovemore, where it talks about these inconsistencies, more especially with regard to migration, and then how these migrants have been treated. This is very interesting because I once published an article where I was looking at what people used to call xenophobia in South Africa. Then I said it's not xenophobia, in fact, it's Afrophobia. And then because xenophobia is very clear, it doesn't necessarily distinguish between an African from the continent and then someone from elsewhere. But Afrophobia is more specific. In answering that question, then I looked at what happened in 1969 when the Ghanaians were kicking Nigerians out, saying that they were responsible for the increase in crime, unemployment, weak economy, and all of the same things that South Africans are complaining about. Then 1983, Nigerians returned the favor. They said we have a problem in Nigeria, overpopulation, unemployment, and all the likes. Then they said everybody must go. What they did, they took these foreign nationals from Europe and other countries to the airport. Then they took Ghanaians to the border on trucks, and then they left them there. So basically saying that this migration has been politicized, even though there were push factors, as Mr. Lovemore was saying, there were push factors from home, and there were pull factors in the host country, but then the manner in which these people were treated was not exactly the same. So the question is still relevant now as it was relevant then. So it means that we have not found an answer. So then it's for all of us to then ventilate this issue and then find a way out. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Le?
Thanks. Thank you, Professor, and thank you very much for the questions. I want to start with the issue of consistency in South African foreign policy. I think I was not sure what was meant by the South Africa's dubious role in the Russia-Ukraine war. Dubious, there's an insinuation there which I'm not too clear on. But essentially, South Africa's approach to peace and security, and I'm glad for the reflection by the gentleman who asked the second question on where our principles come from. The Freedom Charter, which is in a sense the DNA for a lot of the values that's contained in the Constitution and subsequent policy documents, had a reflection on the peaceful resolution of conflicts, and that has been the approach for South Africa's for South Africa on all conflict situations. When we look at Russia-Ukraine, as I said in my initial intervention, from February 2022, when Russia went into Ukraine, South Africa had advocated for peaceful resolution to the conflict. South Africa had called for the implementation of international law, including the UN Charter, and had called for the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. That has been a consistent message that the country has advocated for, and we've advocated for that throughout our engagements in the various processes that we've been involved in. It has been over 2 years. It will soon be going to 3 years of conflict in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The military option, which some have opted for and have promoted, has not resulted in any kind of end or even prospect of end to the conflict. In fact, we've seen further food insecurity, energy insecurity, more loss of lives, and you have this intractable situation. The approach, and including, as I said, we've recently joined a group of countries that are part of a coalition calling for de-escalation, and we're part of other initiatives focused on peace, ultimately is a recognition that the approach we adopted from the day this conflict began in February, or the current iteration of the conflict began in February 2022, has been the approach that more and more countries are taking on board, and is an approach that is respected by both Russia and Ukraine, in the sense that both countries are willing to engage with South Africa in terms of advancing this approach for peace. The fact that the war continues is something that unfortunately is a reality, but ultimately the approach that we've adopted has been that this conflict can only end in one place, and that's on the negotiating table. The approach we've taken in Gaza and in Palestine ultimately is again about the principles of international law, the principles of the UN Charter. The State of Israel, which is a state party to the Genocide Convention, and has bound itself to the terms and conditions of the convention. From the perspective of another state party, South Africa, we maintain that the State of Israel has violated the Genocide Convention. And in that context, we utilize the mechanisms available in terms of international law and in terms of the convention to approach the ICJ. So I would want to stress that the approach we've consistently applied has been a peaceful resolution of conflict. The fact that the use of force should not be a resort by parties to end conflict, and ultimately the international system should be based on the rule of law and the UN Charter. The question related to the African Union is actually a very interesting question, and I think we perhaps should have a longer discussion, and perhaps the Institute should look at the intergovernmental nature of global institutions and the value of intergovernmental nature, because I think it raises many good questions and many interesting debates that we could have. How representative are intergovernmental bodies? Because ultimately it's quite correct that one of the organs, or the principal organ of the African Union that we look at is ultimately an intergovernmental body that is made up of governments. And it's the same with the UN, and there's been a call for more direct representation of individuals and citizens in decision making. But there are other organs of the African Union that we have at our disposal. There's the Pan-African Parliament. There's other mechanisms that perhaps are underutilized and not as strongly capacitated in terms of what they have the ability to do and what they envisage to do. But perhaps that's a discussion we should have on how do we ensure that that the other mechanisms and organs of either the African Union or the United Nations are utilized more effectively. And if they're not, and if the intergovernmental nature of some of the principal decision-making organs are not as effective, or we argue that they're not as effective, how can they be made more effective and more representative, where there is a voice for essentially the ordinary people? One of the things that's often overlooked is that the UN Charter starts with the words "we the people," not "we the governments." Yet it is governments that make decisions in the United Nations, and it's not the people. It's, of course, the argument is that as governments we represent the people, but not all governments do represent their people. Those are questions that perhaps we could explore. I think I'll end there for now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ndobego Kaul. I'm the second year UG student. My question is for the professor from NMU, as well as the associate from DERCO. So our professor, with the presentation, he referenced the fact that now that we have a GNU, or a multi-government coalition that he referred to, he said that it will allow for reviews and reflections of foreign policy. However, when the DERCO representative was speaking, he basically, I'm led to believe that our foreign policy will continue the way that it's been going on with regards to the issues with Gaza as well as the war in Russia. So my question for the DERCO representative is, will the GNU have any influence or impact on future foreign policies? Are there reviews that will be taking place, whether this year or next year, now that we have recently voted for the GNU? And also I wanted to ask, like, from both of you, the professor and our representative, does academia and the practitioners partner together when devising foreign policy? Because it looks as though there's a disconnect, as one says another, but then the other doesn't really. I would like clarity on that.
Thank you very much indeed. My question goes to DECO representative. I mean, there's a growing geopolitical uncertainty. We don't know what tomorrow was looking at, what's happening in America, whether Trump is going to be the president or is it going to be Kamala Harris. With that being said, may we argue that South Africa is mindful of not offending the Western imperialists, in terms of, we know for a fact that the Western imperialists dictate the foreign policy of any other country, particularly the global south. With that being said, when you say the country is caught between a rock and hard place, I mean, it's scary. Like, moving forward, we just don't know what's going to happen in November. I mean, if Trump becomes the president, will you have to relook your approach in terms of the presidency of the G20?
Thank you very much. I also want to sort of address it to our colleague from DERCO. Well, for me, the question is, what is really the content of, or no, not the content, what is the format of the foreign policy? Because yes, there's the policy that's formulated and driven mainly by DERCO, but all 25 other ministries have an international component. Whether it's the Department of Home Affairs or Education, Higher Education, or Trade and Industry is very obvious, or whether it is any of these departments have an international office with an international relations component, which I would argue actually becomes part of foreign policy. At another level, most of the provinces, and you are very much involved in that, in that research, the sort of so-called paradiplomacy, where provinces, the Western Cape is a good example of that has their own initiatives. And then there's even at the metro or local level, where some cities have also international relations. So the question about, that we have talked about is mainly sort of at the DERCO level that we are looking at it. But what about these others? And in terms of foreign policy in relation to national interest, I mean, if it deals with home affairs, it's about immigration, it's about visas. If it is about education, it's about students who can study at other parts of the world. It all accumulates. So what should we then regard as our foreign policy? Is it just what you presented to us, or is it actually the whole portfolio of foreign policy plus the international components of everything else, all the other departments? Is it justified to look at it like that, or should we look at the more exclusive focus on DERCO's policy?
Thanks, Prof. Kutse. I think we should get the speakers to respond, then we'll take another round of questions. Let's start with Mr. Lai this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The issue of again, there's so many questions that come out of here that can result in deeper discussions that doesn't necessarily focus on what we're discussing today, but how does foreign policy get devised, and the role of civil society in academia, etc., in framing foreign policy. The role of business in framing foreign policy. There are questions about business and the flag. Does the flag follow business, or business follows the flag, etc.? So there's so many questions, and we perhaps should get into these kind of discussions at some stage. But the question about the municipalities, the provinces, different departments all engaging on foreign policy issues, ultimately, the guardian of South Africa's foreign policy is the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. The Foreign Service Act makes it very clear that DIRCO is the guardian and the coordinator of South Africa's foreign policy approaches. And our approach is based on the National Interest Document, the Foreign Policy Act, the Foreign Service Act, in terms of the values that we have and what is it that we pursue. We strive to ensure, and through our mechanisms we have within the governance structures that government has adopted, there is attempts to coordinate the approach we have to ensure that we have a coordinated approach and system in terms of our engagement with different countries on foreign policy issues. The question about how the world is changing, and I think, as we look at global relations, over the last 20 or 30 years, since South Africa's democracy, we've seen significant changes in global relations. We saw the end of the Cold War, where you had perhaps arguably a unipolar world, and now we have what is termed as a multipolar world. We have many centers of power. And how do we navigate around that? South Africa sees itself as I said, we are a country on the African continent as part of the Global South, and we work within various alliances, within various groupings to ensure that we're able to advance our foreign policy interests. We are part of the African group, part of the African Union, but as we negotiate in multilateral fora, we are part of the African group. We also engage within the Group of 77, which is the largest group of developing countries that is currently chaired by Uganda, which advances the interests of developing countries primarily on economic and development issues. We work within the non-aligned movement primarily on political issues to advance the interests of the Global South. We work within the BRICS, which is a grouping of countries mainly from the Global South, but includes a country like Russia, and of course China, which sees itself as part of the Global South, to ensure that we look at the multilateral or the global governance system, and we look at how do we address some of the key global challenges working within a grouping of this nature. We are also, again, part of the G20, which we will chair. And the question about the G20, South Africa's strategy and the priorities that we've outlined thus far in terms of what we intend to do with the G20, it has been developed based on our own priorities and that of the Global South and the African continent. That will not change depending, your question was whether the US election will have an impact on South Africa's priorities in the G20. The G20 was primarily created to ensure macroeconomic stability in the aftermath of the 2008 global crisis. How do we ensure that as we navigate around those issues of macroeconomic stability, we ensure that the Global South is part of the decision-making processes, but was also able to advance its own issues, advance its own development priorities, ensure that it has access to development financing, it has the means of implementing the development goals that we've set. And that has been the approach that we've adopted in developing our own G20 priorities. And that will remain irrespective of what happens globally, because ultimately that is the approach we see that the G20 should be focusing on. I think I've covered the questions that were asked.
I understand. There was a question about the GNU and foreign policy.
I'm trying to recall. Whether it will change.
Yeah.
The question, yes, sorry, apologies for that, the first question. Look, what I try to do, and again, I'm not a politician, I'm a civil servant, a practitioner of foreign policy working within government. We as practitioners, we follow the policies of the government of the day. And what I tried to reflect in my initial interaction was to show that in the months and weeks that have followed the formation of the GNU, it has been a consistent approach in terms of what we have done. Our engagements on continental issues, our engagements on multilateral issues, our engagements with our bilateral partners have all been consistently applied in the same manner that we have done so for the last 30 years, essentially, as part of democratic South Africa. Whether that will change, I think that is question marks that was raised in the first part of this discussion as well. How will the GNU play itself out, and what will the changes that the GNU ultimately brings about? But from where we are right now, what I'm saying is that the approaches we've adopted, including our strategy for the G20 next year, has been based on the values that we have developed over the last 30 years, and the foreign policy values that we have, which ultimately it has as the Constitution as its backbone. So it's difficult to answer your question very clearly because we're not sure how the GNU will play itself out, broadly speaking, and the future of the GNU. But from where we stand right now, we are consistently applying our foreign policy priorities as we have been doing.
Thank you. Professor Babesolo?
I'll answer the one question that was directed at me by Mr. Cowan, and I'll answer it in two ways. One, the impression created is that there is basically a conflict between policy reviews and then policy consistencies. In terms of the policy cycle, it follows the same pattern in the sense that you have a policy need, you have policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, and policy review. Those 5 phases or 5 stages. What then happens is that when you do a policy review, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will always change what you had before. All you do is a compliance issue to say that when you formulate a policy, you indicate at the end how often will that policy be reviewed. If it's every 3 years, every 5 years, whatever the case is, when you review the policy, but you feel that it still achieves the goal for which it was meant, you then keep it as it is, except that it then starts from the new date when it was reviewed. That is part of the answer. But the second part of the answer is to look at this issue from a micro level and a macro level. At a macro level, my colleague from DECO is absolutely right in saying that most of the foreign policy positions will remain the same. But when it comes to the micro level, where the nitty-gritties are discussed, there might be some differences. I'll make one example. A question has been asked about how South Africa has responded to Israel's attack on Palestine versus Russia's attack on the Ukraine. So at a macro level, South Africa's foreign policy agenda is the same. That is, we take the diplomacy approach or the soft power approach as opposed to hard power that other countries have been basically propagating, and then America speaking in tongues, preaching peace on the one hand while supplying arms on the other. That's a story for another day. But the reality is you look at this issue either at a macro level or at a micro level, and that is where we are most likely to see some changes. If hypothetically speaking, the DA and other smaller parties were to say to the ANC, we have taken a stance that you are taking Israel to the ICJ. Why can't you do the same with Russia and take Russia to the ICJ? That is the micro level approach that I'm talking about, where you may find that some of the policy positions might be modified to accommodate the other members of the coalition, whereas up to the 6th administration, the ANC was clear as to what it wanted to achieve for the country, and then it consistently implemented that. But now it's a different ball game, given the fact that you now have different role players. So yes, indeed, you can review and still keep the policy the same. Then that is where the issue of consistency comes in. But then if you feel like change is necessary, then we'll implement those changes. And then in that case, our foreign policy agenda might change in terms of detail or at a micro level, whereas at a macro level, we might be maintaining the same status quo. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Prof. Let's get the last round of questions.
Thank you. My name is Sizo. I have two short questions. So the first question is, what is South Africa's preferred approach to engagement with major powers like China? Is it multilateral or bilateral? Because we have been debating on this question on how can we better engage China to optimize our outcomes. So we saw South Africa and Senegal, they had state visits. It's like they were running as fast as they can to get to China first and try to have some agreements that will benefit their particular countries. Instead of maybe pushing a continental agenda as outlined in the Agenda 2063. There's a lot of things that were said in the Agenda 2063 that countries in Africa could maybe coalesce around and then negotiate with China based on that agenda, which outlines African priorities. So what is South Africa's preferred approach when it comes to engaging major powers like China? We have, I think, the ability to help, because I mean they promised Africa $50 billion in funding, and there's a lot of infrastructure projects now that we're talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area. There's a lot of continental infrastructure projects which could benefit from such funding. So why not prioritize those projects rather than bilateral engagement?
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Larry from the Department of Politics and International Relations. I have a curiosity, and I think that informs my question. And the question is, what is the influence of external powers like Russia, considering its relationship with South Africa, on the inconsistencies that Dr. Matambo identified earlier in terms of South Africa's foreign policy position, number one, and regarding China, what is the place of national economic interests in South Africa's foreign policy position? And particularly, I'm speaking with respect to South Africa's reaction to taking Israel to the ICJ. To what extent, though subtly, it is not pronounced, subtly, to what extent do we think an external power, which seeks to, in a way, get back at another power, is influencing South Africa's decision, to act that way, even though we can find that template, the template to fight for human rights as highlighted in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. To what extent do we think an external influence, have this underplay in South Africa's actions and reactions?
The last question.
Thank you very much. My first question, I would like to preface by saying, to me, it makes great sense why South Africa is part of BRICS and why it's part of the United Nations, because at the United Nations, we did put the Ezulwini consensus. We do definitely want permanent seats at the United Nations Security Council with veto powers, nothing less. I would like Professor Ngomen Zulu and the official from DERCO to comment on that, because we've been given a proposal. Yes, you can get the permanent seats, but with no veto powers. I think actually that is very demeaning, that is very humiliating, and what is the way forward from there? Second question, why does South Africa belong to the G20? I would accept that we belong to BRICS because BRICS is very revolutionary, and in a short space of time, they've done revolutionary things. We have a new development bank, and it has already disbursed infrastructure finance to South Africa recently and to all the BRICS members. To me, that is very revolutionary, and it also supports the Belt Road initiatives and other infrastructure developments in Africa. That is what BRICS is doing. and good luck to that and to the summit. Why we belong to United Nations? Because we want permanent seats, because 70% of issues discussed at the United Nations, they concern Africa. So why are we part of G20? If the official from DELCO can let me know that, is it for symbolism? Is it for soft power? Because we're not getting the bang out of our rand. I think we're wasting money because already we're in BRICS, already we're at the United Nations. What are we doing in the G20? Because it's dominated by G7 countries. What are we doing there? What practically are we gaining from the G7? Thank you very much. Nyabong.
Thank you. Let's hear from Professor Gomez, and then we will continue with the line. Prof.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me start with the question that was asked by Obutsizo with regards to South Africa's approach to China, whether it should be at a multilateral level or at a bilateral level. For me, it's neither bilateral nor multilateral. It's a combination of both. It goes back to the point I made earlier on about realism, saying that realism is state-centric. There are certain advantages that will accrue to South Africa when forging bilateral relations with China. And then, of course, at a regional level, in the case of SADC, and at a continental level, there will also be advantages that will accrue. But the reality is that when you operate at a bilateral level, you are most likely to get the results sooner than later, simply because you decide as a country, you agree on the terms of reference, and then you sign the deal, and then the deal is sealed. Whereas in terms of SADC and the AU, there will be many processes that will be involved, and of course, other countries will still be asking certain questions, so it will take longer. Of course, in the broader scheme of things, when you operate at a multilateral level, you are most likely to achieve more than you would at a bilateral level. But for the reasons I've stated, I don't think it's either or. You have both, but then it's just in terms of priorities, you look at where the advantages would be, and then you take a decision based on that. Then there is this question also from the colleague from political science about external powers' influence on South Africa's inconsistencies. Yes, of course, you will find that some of the decisions we take as individual countries, for those decisions to be taken, you also have to consider the broader picture. In this case, then, you will find that some of the external powers do have an influence. You may find that countries that have an economic muscle or a financial muscle, or countries that have a military muscle, those countries have a louder voice compared to other countries. So in that sense, then, you will find that they will definitely influence what we do. A case in point is what happened with us in South Africa when we were basically taking a firm stance, saying that we are not going to allow America to dump their chickens here. We threatened that we'll be kicked out of AGOA. And then before we knew it, we were part of that. We agreed that, okay, as much as we have our own chickens, just bring your chickens and we'll see what those are the situations that we are faced with. So whether we like it or not, the international community, more especially external powers, will influence our domestic and foreign policy, albeit in different magnitude. Then the last one from Dr. Ngobe, South Africa belonging to these multilateral organizations, then providing the reasons as to why we're part of the UN Security, we want to be part of the UN Security Council, and then why we are part of BRICS, and then why are we even participating in G20? Sometimes, of course, my colleague from DEC will answer this question more directly, but from where I'm standing and from my understanding of international relations is that there will be instances where you want to leverage on what you have access to or what you are able to do. Let's say, for example, you want a position in the AU, be it the AU Commission or any other position. Among other things that are going to put you at an advantage is evidence that you are also involved at a global level. So if you have chaired, for example, the G20, like we are going to chair the G20, that will definitely give us a plus. So even if there are no immediate benefits but in the long run, we stand a chance of benefiting more in the continent or in the SADC region for that matter. So basically then it means that we may not see all the results immediately, but some of them might come in the pipeline. So I'll end there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Mr. Stanley.
Thank you. Briefly on the issue of multilateral and bilateral engagements, foreign policy is advanced through both engagements with countries bilaterally and multilaterally. Multilaterally through international organizations, groupings that we belong to, and bilaterally through direct contact. There's no contradiction in the sense that we all, as countries of the globe, engage with each other through these various forums. Multilateral engagements, primarily in the case that you raised, in the case of China and FOCAC recently, the focus was in the multilateral engagement on China's partnership with the African continent and how do we leverage that support for the African continent, particularly the development priorities of the continent. The bilateral engagements we have with China are essentially to ensure that we have trade and investment and bilateral relations with China as a country, to ensure that, if we look at the triple challenges that South Africa faces, unemployment, inequality, and poverty, if we are to address those challenges, the President has made it clear, we need foreign direct investment, we need investment in this country, we need job creation. These are the issues that we would want to advance with our bilateral partners, including building closer political relations with countries. During his engagements at the General Assembly in New York, for example, you may have seen in the media, in addition to his work and his engagements in meetings at the United Nations, the President engaged in economic diplomacy program, including having meetings at the New York Stock Exchange, etc. Why is this? Because there's been a focus and an important focus placed by his administration on job creation, on investment, on driving investment into South Africa. So that we achieve through bilateral contact and through bilateral engagement with our partners. Dr. Nube, your questions I think are very interesting and really, I think you should convene some of these discussions. We need to have long discussions on some of these issues you raised. I firstly want to say that we did not join the UN just to be part of the UN Security Council and to get the veto. The UN Security Council is one of 6 principal organs of the United Nations. South Africa joined the United Nations and is part of the United Nations as Democratic South Africa, because of course South Africa joined the UN in 1945 when it was created, and that wasn't Democratic South Africa. But South Africa prioritizes its engagements in the UN because we now believe that it is necessary to work collectively with other countries to address global challenges. When it comes to issues like the disarmament and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the issues of addressing climate change, the issues of achieving global sustainable development goals, and indeed the issues related to global peace and security, which the Security Council deals with. It's important to work collectively with other countries to achieve that. The issue of Security Council and the presence of Africa in the Security Council's permanent categories is of vital importance. And you're quite right. The fact that the Security Council deals to a large extent with African conflicts and does not have in its representation in the permanent category an African member, neither does it have a Latin American member for that matter. It basically represents, the Security Council represents an old archaic system of global governance that reflects the world as it was in 1945 and needs reform. The Zobiri Consensus, of course, is the African common position on reform of the Security Council. We are concerned, though, that there has been no movement on Security Council reform, despite decades of engagement, and the Pact of the Future that was adopted by world leaders 10 days ago does, again, call for urgent reform of global governance institutions, including the Security Council. But there's already consensus which drives our own approach as an African country in terms of what is it that we want in a reformed Security Council we've not been able to achieve much, and we've not been able to have movement on reform, primarily because the global system has been created in such a way that makes it very difficult to make meaningful changes. Those that are that have the power have made it, and I think you are aware of this in terms of the changes that are needed to the UN Charter that would allow us to have representation, that would ensure that the permanent members give up that right that they only have. The issue of the veto is a principal position of Africa. Actually, the African Common Position says that the veto is an unfair system, and the veto should be done away with. But what the African Common Position does say that as long as the veto exists, the veto should be given to all permanent members or all countries that become permanent. So there's for example, a model for reform where some countries believe that you can have new permanent members but without a veto. And the African Common Position is a much more principled one, which says that if you do have the veto, even though it's a system that should be ultimately be done away with, but as long as you have it, it should be given to new permanent members. The question as to why we belong to the G20 is an interesting one. Ultimately, it goes back, and I alluded to this in a previous intervention. Why was the G20 created? G20 was created to deal with macroeconomic governance. It deals with ensuring that global economic policy, it essentially devises global economic policy, and it is made up of arguably the 20 most powerful economies globally. So 19 countries and now 2 international organizations. You had the European Union, which was the 20th member, and now you have for the first time the African Union. So you have 21 entities, 19 countries and two international organizations that make up the G20. It is 20 of not the largest economies of the world, because if you look at GDP or you look at, you work out the largest economies, it's not necessarily the largest economies, but it is arguably the 20 most influential economies of the world. If we were not at the table, if we were not in the G20, and I think you're looking at, in terms of the manner in which you framed the question, you looked at what is it that we derive out of BRICS, or what is it that we derive out of the UN. It may be less tangible in the sense of the G20, but it is not less important being a member of the G20. If we were not at the table as South Africa, being the only African country, by the way, that has been at the G20, and only now you have the African Union as a whole that is there, we would be out of the discussions which defines global economic policy. Global macroeconomic policy is being defined at the G20 table. If we are not there, we are not able to advance the work of the Development Working Group, which is an essential part of the work of the G20, which focuses on global development issues to ensure that we look at issues like domestic resource mobilization, financing for development, issues relating to tax, etc., where resources should be mobilized for the interests of developing countries. If we are not there, we will not have a voice to add to that discourse. So we believe that it's essential to be part of these discussions, and it is our belief in multilateralism and global collective action that it's important to be at the table where these discussions are. If you are not at the table, these discussions will go on without you, and you will then be marginalized. That is the problem. The problem in 1945 is, by and large, Africa was not at the table when the UN was created. You had, three African countries. You had Ethiopia, Egypt, and South Africa that was at the table. And of course, a very different South Africa, which was the South African Prime Minister at the time was part of the architects, one of the architects of the UN Charter, but it marginalized the African continent because the government of that day was not interested in ensuring that countries of the global south and countries of the continent are part of the decision-making processes. So it's important for us to be there and to be part of the decision-making. And that's the reason we would want to advocate that it's important that South Africa be part of the G20. I do want to say that we have started as DIRCO engagements with civil society and academia on the G20, but we would want to continue that. We've had, I think, 1 or 2 engagements thus far, and we intend to do much more. And we do hope these kind of voices are brought to the discussions, because the G20 provides an opportunity for us to add our voice, and particularly within the context, the G20 has something called the T20, the Think 20, which is where academia particularly plays a role, but also within the larger context of the G20, we will be looking at how do we integrate more voices in terms of formulating G20 policy. Thank you.
Okay. I think what is left for me to do now is to first thank our speakers, Professor Ngomezulu, who's able to join us through the virtual platform, and Mr. Lai, who brought for us the DECO perspective. I really do appreciate your input. I also want to thank the audience for all the questions and the contribution. On that note, we've come to the end, not just the end of this session, but we've come to the end of the seminar. On behalf of the IFK, I want to thank you all for making time to join us in this important conversation. And I hope we'll see you again some other time. Thanks.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.